All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm Will Parkhurst. I'm going to be talking to you today about Nietzsche. And it's really been my pleasure to be here and do the archival work here. They just have an amazing group of texts that I'll be showing you some of them in my presentation, and then you can take a look at them afterwards. So my work does a couple of different things, right? I look at who Nietzsche was influenced by, who Nietzsche influenced, and also I try to use archival evidence to answer historical questions. So if we're interested, say, in a connection like Nietzsche's influence on Mark Twain, we might find that that Mark Twain says he hasn't read Nietzsche. However, a little bit further in the transcription, he talks about one of the events that happens in Nietzsche's life. And when we look at other archival evidence, such as Mark Twain's secretary's diary, of all things, she read Nietzsche to Mark Twain. So there's evidence in lots of really bizarre places that you don't expect. I also use a sort of idiosyncratic methodology because I go searching in places that people don't usually. So there's this debate that's been going on for about 60 years in Nietzsche scholarship about whether he taught this particular course in 1869 or 1872, right? That's scholarship for you. But nonetheless, this debate has been raging for a long time, but philosophers have been doing work in Nietzsche archives. Instead, I took a different approach and thought, well, where would this be documented? And instead, it's documented in the bureaucratic documents, right? So just like professors today have to submit documents for their courses, so did Nietzsche. Turns out he first taught it in 1872, and there's the actual document from 1872 that proves that. So another aspect of what I do is working with Nietzsche's library. So this is Nietzsche's copy of Emerson's essays, and as you can see, he wrote all over it, right? So almost none of Nietzsche's annotations in his library have been cataloged. So one of the things that I'm working with several other Nietzsche researchers internationally is to try to catalog his annotations and give summaries of the works that he read. So that's sort of like the detailed nitty-gritty stuff that I end up doing. Today, we're going to be focusing a little more broadly, right, since I'm not talking to a bunch of Nietzsche scholars who hide in rooms. So we're going to talk about the principle of identity in Nietzsche's work and in science. So I'm dividing my talk into 5 separate sections, we might say. We're going to talk a little bit about foundationalism, so those of you who don't have a background in philosophy can kind of get a grip on why Nietzsche's critique is so deep. Second, we're going to talk about the principle of identity in science throughout history. We're then going to do a little video, of introducing Nietzsche, which is how I introduce Nietzsche to my students in my courses, with Ricky Gervais. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Nietzsche became a symbol of Nazism, very much against his will. So fourth, we're going to go into Nietzsche's argument and how it's supported by science today. And finally, we're going to talk about how Darwin hooks into this. So what is the law of identity? The law of identity is a basic law in classical logic, which is A equals A. It's so basic that Aristotle at one point, when he's asked to defend it, he says, well, anybody who doesn't accept this is a plant, right? So it's so basic that this is where you have to start conversation in logic, at least in classical logic. So typically, the way we learned in school was that there's a hierarchy of science. So, right, the social sciences sort of depend on psychology. Psychology depends on neuroscience. Neuroscience depends on biology. Biology depends on chemistry, and chemistry depends on physics. And physics is sort of where it ends. But when we dig into the literature, into the epistemology of science, it goes a little deeper, right? That physics itself depends on mathematics. That mathematics is coherent. And mathematics itself depends on logic. And for logic to make sense, A equals A has to make sense, right? So it's one of the three laws of thought. I'm not going to go into the other two today, but it's the foundation of science when we look at it this way. So there's, right, the old phrase where somebody says, oh, the world is on the back of a turtle, and somebody says, well, what's the turtle on? And he says, well, it's turtles all the way down, right? And that's what is known in philosophy as a regress argument, right? That it goes on infinitely. Now that's a problem because if your justifications go on infinitely, they never bottom out. So foundationalism holds that we have to start with a foundation, and that foundation for classical logic and classic philosophy is A equals A. So right on top of A equals A, we then get logic, mathematics, physics, etc. Right? So A equals A has been the foundation of Western knowledge for the last for over the last 2,000 years. So what is this law? Right, without going into the nitty-gritty details of the actual logic, we can just sort of talk in an everyday way about it. Right? So A equals A means a thing is what a thing is. Right? If you're going to disagree with that, maybe we'll have you checked into a psych ward or something like that, right? It's very basic. Right? If a thing is A, then it is A. Right? If this ball is red, then this ball is red. Or if this puppy is fluffy, then the puppy is fluffy. Right? So it's a tautology in the sense in which it's true based on the structure. It's analytically true based on the structure, as long as the premises here are true. So let's go into the history a little bit. Excuse me. So we can look at the history of the principle of identity. It certainly starts before, but one of the classic texts that puts forward the principle of identity is Plato. Right? And he puts it forward in the Theaetetus, and Socrates says, first of all, don't you think each of them is different from the others and the same as itself? Right? The same as itself is A equals A. And Theaetetus says, of course. Right? How could you deny such a thing? So this is one of the books that they have here that you'll be able to see after. This is Euclid's Elements from 1482. It's really just beautiful to look at. I encourage you to take a look. They also have here the first translation into English, and it's really interesting that they have like pop-ups in the book, so you can actually visualize the geometry, which is a really fascinating historical point. Right? But the principle of identity becomes important in Euclid's Elements in what is often called, right, common notions. That equality is just one of these basic things that we don't need to prove. Right? If A is equal to B and B is equal to C, A is equal to C. So this is a text where Nietzsche gets the idea of the principle of identity from. He quotes it at one point. So where is this important? Where does this become important in science? If we skip ahead from Euclid, we can find it becoming important in Leibniz. Right? Leibniz, who created calculus at the same time as Newton, writes, the great foundation of mathematics is the principle of contradiction or identity, i.e., that a proposition can't be true and false at the same time. So that A is A and can't be not A. The principle is all we need to demonstrate every part of arithmetic and geometry, i.e., to demonstrate all mathematical principles. So we see, in the history of science, it's foundational, particularly for mathematics. A figure who now we don't know, right? We are very ignorant of him, but he played a really big part, particularly in Nietzsche's thought. He sort of shows the tendency of thought at the time in his work Thought and Reality, where he says, in the principle of identity, we find the supreme a priori principle of all thought and all knowledge. Now, a priori means before experience, so it's true before experience. So it's the foundation. So moving on from Spur and Leibniz, around the 1830s or 50s, we start to see the second law of thermodynamics proposed by these two gentlemen, and they end up getting discussed quite a bit in the text Nietzsche is reading. In particular, one of the hot topics of the day is that based on the second law of thermodynamics, the universe will come into a state of equilibrium. That is, it will have a heat death, right? That all motion will stop and heat will be distributed equally. So this, at the time, is kind of like what chaos theory was in the 90s, right? Everybody's talking about it. It's that weird stuff going on. So although Nietzsche probably didn't have the mathematical background to understand why these were the case, he read a lot of philosophers and scientists who could, sort of dumb things down for him a bit. So we've got four people who sort of critique the identity of atoms that's necessary to get the second law of thermodynamics off the ground, with Volk, Leibniz, Helmholtz, and Caspari. So we've got a variety of different people at the time that are well known who are pushing forward a sort of critique of identity or a reestablishing a reapproach. So not only is it these large philosophical issues and scientific issues that are happening, but we're also seeing the problem of identity start rippling in science at the time. For example, in Schriedlin's Scientific Botany, we start to see the problem of identity occur with regard to whether or not species are self-identical. Like maybe individual things are self-identical, but can we talk about that in terms of species? So we also see this in the work of Liebig. In particular, he's talking about copper oxide and how it can gain and lose properties and still be the same thing. Right? So one thing over time that changes properties, but is still identical. We also get Moll when he's talking about vegetable cells. He talks about how the sort of physiological identity of plants that we see, that when we observe, might not be the identity themselves. So we could have two different species that look exactly alike to our eyes. So these ideas are sort of bubbling under the surface. And I want to talk about this, but I also want to say I'm very much not qualified to talk about this. So while I have taken courses on quantum theory, I'm going to explain it as layman-like as I can. So with the double slit experiment, it suggests that light can behave both like a particle and like a wave. So if we imagine a single slit and something to record, and we imagine a paintball gun shooting through the slit, we'd imagine we'd get a line here. And if we did two slits, then we'd get two lines. But one of the interesting things is that when we do this with light, we First did it with electrons in 1961, I believe. We don't get two lines. We get what this pattern is over here, which suggests that the electrons are interfering with themselves. Now, to explain that, I'm going to use the help of some physicists, because that's not what my PhD is in. So, in the 1930s, both von Neumann and Burkhoff suggested that these sort of conclusions actually mean that the old classical forms of logic just don't really apply. So, as originally formulated by Burkhoff and von Neumann in the 1930s, classical logic simply provides the wrong results when we attempt to apply them to quantum physics. Right? The math doesn't turn out right. So they suggest that the principle of identity simply can't be taken as a universal law of nature as Plato and Aristotle believed. So if we fast forward a little bit, excuse me, to a book from 1995, it suggested that there are entities, or non-entities, quanta entities, that the law of identity doesn't apply to, right? He says if an entity is a this something, then field quanta are not entities. They lack numerical identity. Now, reading this, you should be like, that sounds crazy. What? But, right, these claims occur again. So another book that we have here, right, repeated again in 2006. And in a fairly recent book by Lewis Peter, he suggests, on this view, the basic ontology presented to us by quantum mechanics is one of relations. And the question of the individuality or otherwise of the relata doesn't arise. One can simply forgo the particle description. Right? So we don't need the principle of identity to get things running. We can talk coherently without presupposing it. So Lowell, one of a philosopher who comments on this, puts forward this as one potential way in which we can explain some of the weirdness in quantum mechanics. He doesn't like this answer particularly, but he puts it forward as a possible candidate. He says, perhaps it is erroneous to assume that whatever A may be, there must be an objective fact of the matter as to whether or not A is self-identical. That is, A equals A cannot be assumed to be true. Right? So this quantum physics is telling us something really strange, that the foundation of logic, since Plato, there's a problem with it. So I personally don't want to draw too many conclusions from quantum physics because that's not my area of expertise. Right? And as Lewis suggests, so very little can be concluded unconditionally on the basis of quantum mechanics. The best we can say is that not everything in our received classical worldview can be right. So what most contemporary theorists suggest is that one solid candidate is the principle of identity might not be universal. So that's sort of where we are in contemporary science. So let's hop into our introduction to Nietzsche. Hey, I'm running on time. This is great. So many of you probably have heard a little bit about Nietzsche, maybe even took a course on him, or maybe you just know about him from popular culture. And one of the things, at least that most of my students come in with, is the view, well, wasn't Nietzsche a Nazi? Some of the sort of evidence for this, right, is that in the Second World War, soldiers were given sort of texts to choose from, what to take to the front. One of them was the Bible, and another one was Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Right? And Nietzsche became sort of emblematic of Nazism and anti-Semitism. However, the reason for this is somewhat complicated, because Nietzsche himself was not anti-Semitic, but his sister was. So his sister was extremely anti-Semitic, married an anti-Semitic leader. Nietzsche disliked this so much he refused to go to their wedding. So she ended up, we'll talk about this a little later, she ended up covering up his anti-Semitic views to make him a sort of icon that Nazis could use. So this is from a letter that he wrote to her. Your association with an anti-Semitic chief, her husband, expresses a foreignness to my whole way of life, which fills me ever again with ire and melancholy. It is a matter of honor to me to be absolutely clear and unequivocal regarding anti-Semitism, namely opposed, as I am in my writings. Right? So that's a pretty clear statement. So there's something very strange that has gone on in the history of Nietzsche interpretation, and one of the people who's going to help us explain that is Ricky Gervais, right? He's a comedian, not a scholar, so afterwards we'll have to, rein him in a little bit and clarify some facts. But nonetheless, this is a clip that I show to my students. It's humorous. It does deal with the Holocaust, just to warn you. But it explicitly deals with how really bizarre it is that Nietzsche became an emblem of anti-Semitism.
Not a traditional subject for comedy, the old Holocaust. But I will say something about the Holocaust, and I'm sticking my neck out here, but in my opinion, I blame Adolf Hitler. He was the ringleader. Old Adolf. That name's died out, hasn't it? He killed that dead, didn't he? No one's calling their kid Adolf nowadays. No little Adolfs going to school. Loads of Brads and Angelinas, but no, look, you don't hear the teacher doing the register. Brad here, Angelina here, Adolf here. I do that quick so no one can take a picture of me doing that. No, but people make excuses for him. People say, oh, he was stupid, he was easily led, he didn't mean that. What do you mean he didn't mean that? They say, oh no, he was influenced by the political philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, right? Because Nietzsche wrote this paper talking about a Superman. He said, not all men are born equal. And Hitler misinterpreted this and went way too far with it. And think of that. You're a great scholar, you've done this work, and you get a call from the Führer. And the Führer goes, all right, Nietzsche. Yes. Yeah, good. What do you want? He goes, just read your book. What do you think? Love it. Love all that. Man and Superman, not everyone's equal. Kill all the Jews. Sorry? Not everyone's equal, so kill all the Jews. I didn't like that. I read between the lines. I didn't mean that. That's terrible. You haven't been killing Jewish people, have you? What? Have you been killing Jewish people? Yeah. Yeah. A little bit. A few. How many? 6 million. 6 million? That's all. I won't do any more. Leave it at 6. That's terrible. I won't do any more. Stay for dinner? Well, I will, but be careful in future. I will. Are you writing any other books? Well, I am, but I'm scared to tell you about it. I won't do anything. What's your new book called? My new book is called The Gypsies. Do we need him?
All right, so there's obviously some humor in that, right? Because it's just sort of absurd when we think about it. In the situation, right, is hypothetical that he's talking about. Nietzsche had a mental collapse, right, in January of 1889, right? And Hitler was born after that. So they're obviously not having this conversation actually. Right, so after Nietzsche collapsed, his sister ended up taking over control of his estate and his writings. And she ended up censoring his writings in particular ways and editing them in such a way that they could be used as Nazi propaganda. So she ended up establishing a Nietzsche archive where just a host of editors all were doing this task of censoring his work and making it into Nazi propaganda. So there's an explicit effort to edit and distort Nietzsche's work to turn it into something that the Nazis can use. So here in this picture, we see Elizabeth herself meeting Hitler at the Nietzsche archive. And Nietzsche, in his state after his mental collapse, is obviously not aware of what's happening. But if he was, I'm sure he would just be furious at this situation. So part of my work that I do in history is figuring out what the original texts were. Right? So part of the work that I'm going to be doing over in New York is reconstructing parts of his autobiography. His sister edited, so we have a variety of drafts and letters and things like that that were suppressed. And they can tell us something about the version that she ended up publishing years later. So let's actually get into Nietzsche's argument here. So again, we've had this presupposition that the principle of identity is the foundation of knowledge since Plato, at least. And Nietzsche is very suspicious of any sort of Platonic knowledge. That's knowledge that doesn't come from our empirical study, knowledge that's supposed to be truths based on rational insight, right? He's like, just because you think you believe something and it's undoubtable, that doesn't mean it's undoubtable. That means you don't think you can doubt it, right? So he pushes this critique into logic. In his work Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, behind all logic and its seeming tyranny of movement, there also stands valuations, or more plainly spoken, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain type of life. For instance, that the definite is worth more than the indefinite, or appearance worth less than truth. Such estimates could still be mere foreground estimations, despite all their regulative importance for us, right? Not for truth itself, but its importance for us and our survival. A certain sort of foolishness as may be necessary precisely for the preservation of beings like us. So he wants to suggest, and we'll see him suggest this a couple more times, right, that perhaps the truths of logic and the truths of reason are something that we need to survive and our ancestors needed to survive, and they're very useful, but maybe they're just very useful fictions. So he suggests that our concepts, right, our logic, our rational intuitions are things that we inherit from our ancestors. He writes that the mind, right, our rational capacities, has become and is still becoming that, among countless ways of interfering and judging, the one now most familiar to us is somehow the most useful to us and has been passed down to us because the individuals who, through that way, right, that way of reasoning, had better prospects. That this, nothing about true and untrue. So just because something is useful for the survival of the species does not mean that it is true. So Nietzsche goes so far, and this is where his critique gets really deep. that maybe our belief in identical things, that objects are identical to themselves, is actually a concept that we inherited. So he suggests in Human All Too Human, the belief that identical things exist has been handed down to human beings from the period of lower organisms. So Nietzsche, strangely, I haven't figured out why, he thinks it started with plants. That for some reason, plants have the ability to identify things, and anything lower than that doesn't. Not sure why that is, but it's what he thinks. So, right, if we inherit things, that's not actually a bad thing. That's not a problem. The problem is, what if they're wrong, right? Certainly, animals can be wrong about things. They don't have the sort of rational intuitions that we have. What if we got those from lower organisms? He says, through immense periods of time, the intellect produced nothing but errors. Some of them turned out to be useful and species preserving. Those who hit upon or inherited them fought their own fight for themselves and their progeny with greater luck. Such erroneous articles of faith, which were passed on by inheritance further and further, finally almost became part of the basic endowment of the species. So perhaps these basic ideas, these rational intuitions that we think are undoubtable, unchallengeable, and it's unfathomable to imagine a world without them, maybe they themselves have been passed down from lower organisms. Now, you might hear that and say, whoa, 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 slow down. Are you serious? Right? Like when we think about science and a lot of the things that scientists say, they correlate usefulness and survival with truth very often, right? So if you're having false perceptions, your likelihood of survival is going to go down, right? That's sort of a generalization, we might say, right? If you're out on the savannah and instead of seeing a tiger, you see a fluffy bunny, that's a problem, right? So, for example, Palmer says, evolutionarily speaking, visual perception is useful only if it is reasonably accurate. Or, to put it another way, like Geiser and Dale, in general, perceptual estimates are nearer the truth, have greater utility than those that are wide of the mark. Right? So you can go through, I don't know, 100 people who say something along these lines that are working in science. However, in 2010, and since then, the amount of articles that have been coming out is just obscene. We get a picture of the world that really pushes back on this. So this article came out in the Journal of Theoretical Biology by several authors. Donald Hoffman has actually been doing work collaboratively with a lot of people. And he's at UC Irvine, I believe. He writes, we find that vertical perceptions, that's true perceptions, right, can be driven to extinction by non-veridical strategies that are tuned to utility rather than objective reality. So the perception that is true, the perception that is accurate, can get driven to exist out of existence by the false one, but the one that is false but is useful. So this suggests, they conclude, that natural selection need not favor veridical perceptions. So when they're doing this modeling, this is pretty groundbreaking. So just published like 2 days ago, you could get it. It's getting shipped to my house right now. I haven't read it yet, so I can't tell you if it's good. I'm sure it's going to be great. But he just published this book, right? The Case Against Reality. So why evolution hid the truth from our eyes, right? So being a scientist, he doesn't go into this sort of deep philosophical questions I've been talking about today, but he does give empirical evidence for it, right? And as a philosopher, I can tell you our budget for experiments is a pad of paper, right? So when evolutionary cognitive psychologists actually go out and do the sort of experiments and find the results we think that might be the case, it's really exciting. So what does this mean? This means that contemporary evolutionary cognitive biology suggests that false perceptions can actually be advantageous, right? So among competition, among running away perhaps, this is a very unintuitive conclusion. Nonetheless, this is exactly the sort of conclusion that Nietzsche comes to. He who did not know how to find identity often enough, both with regard to nourishment and to hostile animals, that is, he who subsumed too slowly and was too cautious about subsumption, had a slighter probability of survival than he who in all cases of similarity immediately guessed that they were identical. Right? So if we imagine an ancestor of ours out in the jungle, if you see a flash of red and black in the jungle and go, "That's a tiger," and run away, that might give you an advantage over another one of our ancestors who might have gone, "Hey, that looks like a pretty flower. Definitely it's not like the tiger I saw a little while ago." So the idea here ends up getting explicated even further by Nietzsche to suggest that maybe these false judgments are actually part of just what makes us human. That's part of our ancestry. Right? He says false judgments are the most indispensable to us, that without an acceptance of logical fiction, without a measuring of reality against the purely invented world of the absolute and the self-identical, mankind could not live. So perhaps it is constitutive of what we are as human that we have inherited these mistakes. So here we come up to our last bit here, Darwin. So Darwin, right, when we read his autobiography, he says, I'm not really much for reading philosophy. I don't like to think abstractly. He says, about the great men of philosophy, Darwin wrote, I knew very little. However, right, Darwin, like most figures, has a very different conception of himself that he wants to portray than what is actually going on. Now, what the archival evidence suggests, based on his reading lists, right, he'd make books of what he was reading. I don't know, as an academic, I do that all the time. But in these lists, we find that he's just reading tons of philosophy. Right? For those of you who've taken an intro to philosophy course, you'll probably recognize Hume, right? Locke, another huge empiricist, Berkeley, Montaigne, cut off at the bottom here, but he says he wants to read Aristotle. And notably, he says, I want to read Aristotle because I want to see if he has views like mine, which is pretty interesting. So one of the things that's really weird when I ran into this is that in a letter, Darwin actually expresses the same sort of concern that Nietzsche is putting forward, which, Darwin we think of as a scientist, but this is some high philosophical thinking. He writes, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value at all or trustworthy. Wow. You're like, Darwin said that? Oh, whew, gives me chills. So, let's wrap up here. So we had this idea, this foundationalist idea since Plato, that we start with something like A equals A, like identity, and upon that, we build the rest of Western knowledge. Now, if we don't have that, we might get a little nervous, right? We know what happens when you blow up the foundation of a house, right? Anybody who's built a house knows you have to start with the foundation, right? You can't just leave the house floating on the air, right? You need something at the base. So this should be very worrying. However, right, we can kind of ask, well, if we don't have A equals A, does that mean like everything just explodes, that the world has gone mad and like we can't trust anything anymore? No, of course not. But it does mean that we need to look at science and foundationalism a little bit differently. The foundationalism that worked for Plato and Aristotle, the logic that worked for Plato and Aristotle, doesn't work the same way today. It's not as universal as we once thought. So while we might consider, right, the modern crisis of our times, and if you're hearing about this, you might be like, what are we going to do? Well, we've been dealing with it, right? We've been dealing with it for the last 100 years, right? And we've been dealing with it separately in different disciplines. So, right, in mathematics, they've developed different models for thinking about how our common notions of identity don't actually function when you're doing mathematics and quantum physics, right? We also developed pair-consistent logics that can allow things to be true and false, or neither true or false, right? Obviously, with physics, with quantum physics, we've sort of chucked the idea that the principle of identity is universal, and they can still talk. They can still get around in the world as human beings. We've also developed ways in dealing with this problem in computer science, artificial intelligence, ecological and biological modelings of perception, and also in economic modeling, right? So what seems like, oh my gosh, this crisis, how could this possibly be? Well, we've been coping, right? We've been coping for a long time, and everything has not collapsed. But nonetheless, it's really fascinating to think about the principle of identity, how this was the foundation of Western knowledge, how it came to be doubted, and how we are still today finding workarounds for how to produce science, right? This shouldn't lead us to be science skeptics, right? Science is a very special epistemic enterprise. It gets at knowledge in a special way. And one of the things that it does is it helps to self-correct its basic assumptions. So when I talk to my students about science and where we are, instead of foundationalism, I use the analogy of Neurath's boat. And that's that instead of thinking that we're building a house like we're on solid ground, and we start with a foundation, and if you don't have a foundation, the house is going to collapse. Instead, right, doing science is kind of like being out at sea on a boat, and you have to keep plugging all the holes as they come up, right? And it's not like you can go into shore and just be like, well, we're going to scrap the whole thing, and we're going to go in and build a better boat from the bottom up. You're like, no, we're on this. We can't go in. So science itself is not in jeopardy because of this, but when we understand our history, when we understand the history of science, we can better understand science today. So I'll end with one of my favorite quotes from Nietzsche about humans' ability to change, right, and our ability to adapt and change our knowledge in very important ways. He says, stripping off the skin. A serpent which is unable to strip off its skin will perish. So will all those intellects that are prevented from changing their opinions. They cease to be intellects. So that is where I'm going to leave us today, and thank you for listening to me.
Right, we have time for questions. I'll come by with a microphone. We're videotaping and live streaming, so we want to get the audio of your question on the live stream. So just raise your hand. I'll come by with the microphone. Just be sure to hold it close to your mouth. Otherwise.
Thank you. I've always wondered if we, as animals, we have trouble seeing things as multiple possibilities because of the structure of nerve impulses, which are always on or off, 0 or 1. So we have this sort of digital nature built into us, and that it's hard for us to think outside of that structure. I don't know what you think about that.
So one of Nietzsche's critiques of Aristotle is that Aristotle says, right, of course, the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity must be true because I can't think otherwise, right? And Nietzsche is going to say, no, you're talking about an ability, not truth, right? Those are separate things, right? Just because you can't think something doesn't mean that thing is not true, right? So like if you ever take a quantum mechanics course or read a book about it or an article, or even Einsteinian mechanics, you're sitting there and you're going, what do you mean time dilates when we move? That's nuts. So you'd have to ask somebody who's working with neuroscience and physiology to get the actual biological answer to that question. But Nietzsche certainly thinks that just because we might be physically incapable of thinking something, that doesn't mean that thought is false.
Okay, I've got a question. Let's say that the perception, because people do, you know, they live in perceptions, but that everybody perceives something the same way. The majority think it's this way, and they react to it this way, and other people react to them acting that way. Does that perception ever become the truth?
That is a very old philosophical question. I'm not going to be able to answer it here. But it's an important question, right? It's a question that philosophers ask about, right? Just because we agree on something, does that mean that's the truth, right? If we all agree that maybe, you know, this podium doesn't exist, I think it still exists whether or not we believe it exists. So thinking about that, yeah, I think it's an old philosophical question, and you're right to bring it up, and I don't have an answer.
And this is kind of related to the first question. So you talked about the classical view being that these things have to be true because we couldn't think otherwise. And even if you want to deny that and say just because you can't think otherwise doesn't mean they're true, can we think otherwise, right? Are we still stuck in that? And you mentioned the paraconsistent logics or you know, quantum field theory. I mean, do you think that we have actually transcended classical logic or the law of identity?
So I think that we've shown that classical logic has one field of applicability, and that is not everything in the universe forever, right? That it might work pretty well for, you know, how many kitchen pans do we need at the store, honey, right? But maybe when you're talking about the collapse of a wave function in quantum physics, you're like, maybe it doesn't work in that particular area. Kind of, I suppose you might be able to make an analogy that Newtonian physics still works pretty well on the Earth, right? But once we get up to certain speeds, you start seeing problems, and you have to use some of Einstein's theories to make the calculations come out.
I didn't really have a question, but an observation. And I don't know much about ancient philosophy, but one of them at one time said, you cannot enter the same river twice, which is another way of saying that A is not A. And there it is in the words of the ancients. I don't know if you have a reaction to that.
Yeah, so first off, you're absolutely correct, right? That that was Heraclitus that you're talking about. Heraclitus is one of Nietzsche's favorite people in the history of philosophy, right? He says perhaps out of anyone, Heraclitus might have got it right. So depending on who you talk to, who are ancient scholars, they might even go further and say, Heraclitus would say, you can't even step in the same river once, right? Because it's always already moving. So Nietzsche certainly followed Heraclitus, and he thought that Heraclitus would deny the principle of identity. Excuse me.
Talk is reminding me of reading I've done in Buddhism, the idea that there is no self and that there is no identity even in other objects that we come into. Wondering if Nietzsche had any possible influence from Eastern thought, or if you see the same parallel.
Yeah, so one of the people that he read most and admired most was Arthur Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer was one of the people who really brought Eastern thinking into philosophy in Europe, right? He was reading Sanskrit and reading some ancient thought regarding that. That's where he comes up with this concept of the world is created just out of will, which is more complicated than I can explain. But yeah, he was influenced by Asian thought there. And Nietzsche does talk about Buddhism in comparison to the Western tradition. And he says, right, it's more honest, right? What exactly to make of that, I'm not sure. But there certainly are parallels, and I think you're right to bring them up.
We have time for a couple more questions. All right, I'll get over there, and Brad, I'll come up. As Will mentioned in his talk, we will have a viewing of some rare books across the hall in our History of Science reading room. I wanted to mention that before I forget to do it later. No food or drink in the room, no, but you're certainly welcome to stick around to look at the books. Yes, Cynthia.
There's some recent articles that I've read in Science that Einsteinian physics breaks down at a black hole, which they're still exploring. So, that could be also an analogy of the breakdown of Newtonian physics or the breakdown of Einsteinian physics, which is analogous to what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not a physicist, so I don't keep up quite as cutting edge as perhaps I should. But yeah, certainly the things that we perceive as true in the history of science have pretty much all been wrong, and we've come up with new theories to explain them that better describe the phenomena that we interact with empirically. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Everything is in flux.
yeah.
Does Nietzsche comment on Kant's ideas in his Critique of Pure Reason?
Yeah, he does. So one of the projects that I'm undertaking is looking at all the quotations that Nietzsche made of Kant. Right, so he writes them down in his notebooks, in the annotations of books that he's reading, on scraps of paper. Right, they're just lots of different places. But one of the things that we find is that quotation today is much more consistent than it was back during the time when Nietzsche is writing. And as it turns out, as far as I can tell, every quote that I've found by Kant, we can trace to a secondary work. So he was reading a bunch of work on Kant by other people, by really famous Kant scholars. But all the quotes he copied down. So he took from other works and just put them in his notebooks. And we can tell that because they misquoted him, and Nietzsche repeated the misquotation. So he was familiar with Kant, but at least not from a first reading of the Critique. I should add an addendum on there. He did read his Critique of Judgment. We do know that, but not the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the big Kant book that everybody's scared of.
So this is coming from a physics point of view.
Okay.
There are local truths and there are global truths. And if you're inside that local, you might see things a certain way because that's all you've been exposed to. But if you're outside that bubble, you might have a different global truth. And then there's a bubble outside that and a bubble outside that. So to me, that ties into many of these other comments. It just depends basically on your perspective.
Yeah, so Nietzsche put forward, they call it a doctrine, but that's a little hard line, where he actually puts forward an idea called perspectivism, right? That knowledge is always from a perspective, from a particular standpoint, and that we have to take into account where we are coming from when we talk about our knowledge, what we see. And one of the interesting things that, frustrate any philosopher is that he sees the problem in this view already, right? A traditional rejection of perspectivism, right? Nietzsche might say, everything's just a perspective. And the philosopher goes, aha, I got you. That's not a perspective, right? Because that's a universal truth. And Nietzsche just goes, so much the better. You're like, what? But he saw it coming. So it's not a rejection of his view as much as the rejection of his view is actually a part of the view that he's advancing, which is really tricky. And when Nietzsche gets really tricky, it drives philosophers crazy.
Will, thank you for just such a wonderful lecture.